What's up, thinking athletes? Coach LPZ here. Welcome back to the channel, where my goal is to turn ideas into performance. Today, I'm on a mission to simplify and clarify the concept of lactate threshold. I want you to end up at the end of this video understanding what it is, how to understand your training session based on the concept, and what you can do with that information to then improve the training that you're doing on the road, on your bike, or in your functional training gym. And we're gonna talk about the lactate threshold, which is one of the most important landmarks. Take a sip of coffee. Okay, ready to go. The lactate threshold essentially marks a very important transition point in exercise, but more importantly, it's super tightly correlated with endurance performance, which pretty much means that the higher your lactate threshold, the better you are, or the faster you are, or the longer you're able to go at a specific pace. Understand this, and you'll know how to improve it. And just like that, you're going faster for longer. What does it mean? How do I know where it is? How is this information going to help me improve my endurance performance? That's essentially the questions that I want to answer today in this video. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to define the terms. The harder you exercise, you end up at a point, a clear transition point, where lactate starts to accumulate in your blood at a faster rate. This means that your muscles are now producing more lactate than they're able to recycle. Let's not go down that rabbit hole today, but this is essentially the point that we call your lactate threshold. By the way, I'm going to start referring to it as LT1 for short. Now let's look at why this matters. The main take-home message here is that when you're exercising below LT1, you're essentially going at a rate that you can go for a very, very, very long time. Think about ultra endurance training. And then as soon as you go over LT1, you get to a point where you're going to meet fatigue, exhaustion, and what we would call task failure in the near future. Now, if you go just a tiny bit above, you still have a couple of hours before you reach that failure point. And then the faster you start going after that or above that, the closer and closer failure point is going to occur. Okay, so we all know that an image is worth 1,000 words. A lot of you guys are going to be familiar with the concept of training zones. So let's look at how the lactate threshold correlates with your idea of training zones. Lactate threshold, or LT1, is essentially the boundary between the moderate and the heavy domain, which means that it's the boundary between zone 2 and zone 3. I think it's really important to illustrate this point because there's a lot of confusion, and you're going to hear a lot of people talking online about the fact that when you reach a point above lactate threshold, you start to burn significantly, you start to hurt, and you're essentially in the pain cave. And that's a common mistake that I see people make about lactate threshold, because zone 4 is actually commonly referred to as the threshold zone. So a lot of people will confuse that and think that when you pass the lactate threshold, you're now entering the threshold zone, which again is zone 4, but that's not the case at all. The second threshold, which is the difference between, or the line between zone 3 and zone 4, is completely different than the lactate threshold. When you pass LT1, you're still in a very comfortably challenging level of intensity, and you're still able to go, like I said, likely for many hours. So not to get confused with the second threshold, the lactate threshold is our first threshold. Back to our concept of zone 2 and 3, there are some specific adaptations that are going to occur depending on the zone that you're training in. And all of the adaptations in the training zones are complementary. So if you want a well-balanced endurance program, you want to make sure that you're getting a little bit of each one to maximize your long-term results. So what's happening when you're training in zone 2, when you're training below LT1? You're primarily recruiting slow twitch muscle fibers. You're also primarily mobilizing fat for fuel as opposed to carbohydrates. You don't need to remember these terms, but you're also developing your network of capillaries and mitochondria. And all of these things lead to an improved ability for your body to go long, to endure, and to resist fatigue. A term that we're often going to hear is that you're building your base. So that's a quick overview of why training below LT1 is super important. Now, what happens when I train above? The more fast twitch fibers you're going to be able to recruit, which means that you're likely to be able to smash that like button a little bit faster. The more you switch from burning fat for fuel and now using carbohydrates, like we said, the more lactate starts to be present in the blood. There's also a higher recovery cost associated with every unit of work that you do above LT1. So you're essentially training your body's ability to work at faster work rates. Now, depending on your training experience, you can, to a certain extent, improve lactate threshold by pushing your lactate threshold up by training below it, and also pulling it upwards by training above it. Now for the fun part, how do I take all of this theoretical stuff and apply it to my training? Now we know that good endurance programs split their volume between training above and below LT1. So the first thing that you wanna do is you wanna establish or understand exactly where this pace sits so that you know how to organize your training above and below the threshold. If you're like most people that I've talked to or that I've coached, you're gonna be surprised at how slow you actually have to go if you want to train in zone 2. In the future, I'm definitely going to make more comprehensive videos about how to really triangulate where LT1 is, but you have to leave this video with some practical takeaways to take into your training. So let's give you a quick and dirty way to estimate where your lactate threshold is. Since training below LT1 is essentially defined as training in a metabolic steady state, means that your heart rate is probably not going to drastically increase if you're training at the right intensity, meaning that there's not gonna be much cardiac drift in zone 2. So find a pace that you're able to go for at least an hour without seeing significant rise in heart rate, and that's going to give you a rough idea of where your LT1 sits. From there, make sure you split your total training volume into some work done below LT1, some work done above LT1, and make sure that you do spend a good bit of your time below that threshold. This is gonna make sure that you get the most out of the physiological adaptations that are gonna come from training in the moderate intensity domain, as well as the stuff above. But in my experience, most people do end up training a good fair bit above it and sometimes are lacking or deficient in training below it. I think we're gonna call it here for this one. Think of it as the why and the what behind the idea of lactate threshold. I'm sure you're gonna have questions. I'm sure you're gonna be thirsty for more practical applications. So drop the comments below and help me figure out how we're gonna get more tactical in the next couple of videos and give you more practical tools to improve your endurance training when it comes to training around the lactate threshold and beyond. Before you go, please, please, please do your coach a solid and give me a follow, and I'm gonna catch you on the next one.